Okay, welcome back. That's less than 2 minutes. But we're going to turn now to our keynote conversation. And in fact, we have we have organized the keynote conversation precisely as that. It's really a pleasure to welcome our speaker, our keynote speaker, Mr. Martin Palmer, who's going to talk with us about faith conservation and ESG investing. This panel, as the previous two panels, has been organized by our student club leaders. And I want to introduce the two club leaders who bring our keynote to us today. First of all, Miriam Israel, who's a dual degree student at the Fletcher School and at the Harvard Divinity School. And then secondly, Ciara Moezidis, who's a first-year Master's of Theological Studies at the Harvard Divinity School. It's a pleasure to have everyone with us today. Martin, thank you for coming in from the UK to be with us. I'm going to turn things over to all of you to have what I know is going to be a really lively and exciting conversation that will help us to explore even further ways that religion, science, and diplomacy intersect, and in particular, to think about how the religion-science intersection is helping us to rethink, reconceptualize, and recognize the ways in which diplomacy is practiced and by whom it's practiced. So turning it over to all of you and thanking our viewers for being with us, and also reminding you as well that the bio will be posted in the chat, and also to upload your questions directly to the question and answer. Thank you very much.
All right, so we can get started. I want to say again, thank you to Professor Prodromou for the introductions, and thank you as well to all of our panelists from our prior panel. I think the discussion that we just had about religious communities and climate advocacy flows really perfectly into this keynote discussion. And we want to welcome Mr. Martin Palmer. We're really excited to have our esteemed keynote speaker with us. Mr. Palmer is the CEO and founder of FaithInvest, and was the Secretary General and co-founder of the Alliance of Religions and Conservation, or ARC, where he worked alongside His Royal Highness Prince Philip to help faiths develop environmental and conservation projects around the world. ARC's legacy includes FaithInvest, which we'll talk about more, and WWF, or the World Wildlife Fund's International Beliefs and Values Program.
FaithInvest was founded to accelerate and broaden faith-consistent, values-driven investing by empowering faith groups to invest in line with their values. Mr. Palmer is also the author and editor of more than 20 books on religious and environmental topics. He has translated many ancient Chinese texts, is a regular contributor to the BBC, and is a lay preacher in the Church of England. Thank you so much for being with us today. I know this wasn't a comprehensive bio, but we'll definitely drop that in the chat because there's a lot more to your background. And so let's get started. We're very excited.
Thank you, Ciara, and thank you, Miriam, as well. It's a pleasure to join you. And Elizabeth, thank you so much for this invitation. What an extraordinary thing this is. Religion, science, and diplomacy. I don't know anywhere else in the world that does anything like this. I can only congratulate you on bringing together things that even any combination of two of those would be startling to most people. The fact that you do all three is just really fantastic. So thank you very much indeed for the invitation. Looking forward to this enormously. And now over to you two.
Thank you. So I think we want to just dive right into it and get started talking about a little bit about your current work. So for those who are attending who maybe aren't familiar, maybe you mind giving a brief description of your current work with FaithInvest in particular, and maybe why you think it's timely right now.
Okay, thank you, Miriam. Well, FaithInvest emerged out of my earlier work, which I began with Prince Philip, which was when he was the international president of WWF, which was to work with the faiths, every major faith tradition around the world, and we ended up working with over 700, but within the sort of broad categories of from sort of the Baha'i, Buddhist, Christian, Taoist, Confucianist, on the way up to the Zoroastrians and the Shinto and Sikhs and etc. And what we discovered as we were beginning to work with them on their basic teachings about the environment, which was the key of this, we began in 1986 in Assisi with 5 religions, and we asked them to sort of just tell us, what do you believe is your relationship with the rest of life on Earth? And this drew out the first ever key faith statements on the environment. And initially, when we started working with WWF, I think WWF actually expected that this was going to be the biggest recruitment drive for membership of WWF in the world. You know, if they could get every Catholic, every Hindu, every Muslim, every Buddhist, every Christian to join up and join WWF, their financial problems would be solved and they could save the world. What actually happened was that the faiths were very critical of most of conventional environmental work because they felt that it didn't take issues of justice or gender or equality at all seriously. It didn't at that stage. It's changed over the years. But one of the problems was that the faiths, in most cases, are recovering from 200, sometimes 250 years of persecution, of being ridiculed, of being dismissed as irrelevant, of having their land seized, their followers murdered, their buildings blown up, their schools taken from them, their hospitals taken from them, in the name of nationalism, or in the name of fascism, or in the name of communism. Many different reasons. They come to the secular states with an air of anxiety and uncertainty. And this meant that for a very long time, they have kept quiet, very quiet about quite how much of the planet they own, how many schools they run, how many universities, and how much money they have. And as we began to work with the faiths, we began to appreciate, Prince Philip and I, that the faiths were actually major stakeholders on the planet. The faiths own about 8% or manage on behalf of communities about 8% of the habitable surface of the planet. Another 15% of the planet is considered sacred, and therefore it may not be owned by the faiths, but the fact that it is sacred, it has a sort of penumbra of protection. That means that, for example, in China, the great sacred mountains of the Taoists and the Buddhists, there are 9 key ones, are far more biodiverse than any other mountain structures that do not have that sacred dimension. And we began to also realize that they were running about 50% of schools, according to UNICEF, with whom we worked very closely on their water and sanitation program. 64% of all schools in sub-Saharan Africa are run by the faiths. There would be no education in Africa if it was not for the faiths. About a third of all universities, well over a third of all medical facilities, and so forth. But somehow, partly because they have been dismissed as irrelevant or antediluvian or just not worth bothering about, the secular world had just binned religion. It was okay if you wanted to be religious, it was about as important as whether you liked an Indian takeaway or a Chinese takeaway. It wasn't supposed to actually shape what you did. And certainly there was no sense that the faith should be at the table. And it was really Prince Philip who, inviting the faiths to meet with all the major environmental groups in 1986, opened that door. But what became very clear to us was that somebody needed to do an audit. What did the faiths actually run and own? And we did this. We produced the State of Religion Atlas in 2007. And from that, we realized the sheer stakeholder role of the faiths. And one of the biggest areas was assets. The faiths are the 4th largest investing group in the world. They are, as I've said, they own about 8% of the habitable surface of the planet. That includes forests, it includes housing estates, it includes ports, it includes industrial complexes. But also, they have tens of thousands of buildings in every single country, very often in prime sites, very often underused, but very often the center of communities. So FaithInvest came into being. We closed, when Prince Philip and I set up the Alliance of Religions and Conservation in 1995, we said we'd give it about 20 years because we'd seen so many groups coming into being for very good reasons, and then go on being in order to go on being. So we decided if we hadn't achieved our goal of getting the faiths to develop their own environmental programs based on their own values within 20 years, we should get out of the way because we're obviously no good. If we had succeeded, which we did, we should get out of the way so other people could do it much better than we could do it. And we had our second goal was to get the secular world to take the faith seriously. And by the time we got to 2017, we have been working with the UN, the World Bank, the European Union, most of the major governments around the world, including China, Russia, but also US, Britain, etc. And so it was time to get out of the way. But that was the point at which Prince Philip said, look, we've got them going. they're still not taking seriously the fact that they're stakeholders. They're still they're acting as though they're just gadflies on the edge. Their only role is to kind of roll up and protest and, you know, have the occasional nun thrown down the stairs at a shareholder meeting because it makes a very good photograph in the newspapers. And they're not taking seriously that they're actually part of the problem, as well as potentially part of the solution. And that's why FaithInvest came into being, in order that we could particularly address the investment dimension. The SDGs are based on the presumption that they will be invested in rather than grants given by national governments. And so far, the response has been very poor. And the faith should be, because of their beliefs and values, central to that kind of activity. So that's why FaithInvest exists. We work with every major religion in the world, with all the major and some quite minor and some quite middling the faith investment groups, everything from some faiths which have 70 billion down to some who have 1 million. But each of them we're asking to be faith consistent in how they use their investments. Very often the money that they raise is doing wonderful things, supporting hospitals and old people's homes and orphanages and education programs and all sorts of things. But if the way you've got your money is actually causing the very problems that you're then trying to ameliorate, something's gone a bit wrong. So that's why we exist.
Yeah, thank you. And I think a great point about this sort of drive for maybe more mainstream acceptance by religious institutions from the secular world, but at the same time, maybe a lack of recognition of the impact that religious institutions can have. And I think I mentioned this to you when we spoke last week, but I quoted you actually in a paper that I wrote last semester about this topic, about religious institutions and maybe the role that they're playing in a clean energy transition. And it sort of, I sort of arrived at a similar conclusion of that this maybe just isn't that well known and is an approach that just isn't, you know, as recognized. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how FaithInvest's approach towards investing is maybe different from other divestment movements or maybe ESG focused finance efforts for climate change.
Certainly, Miriam. I hope you got an extremely high mark for your essay with my quote in. I'd be very disappointed if you didn't, and we'll have words with your supervisors later. Our difference is very simple. It's very simple. And it's best summed up, I think, by something completely different from it and yet linked. UNICEF, the world's children's fund, has for the last 10 years or more been promoting a thing called Education for Sustainable Development. It's a worldwide program designed to ensure that at every sort of level in schooling, children are made aware of the issues around sustainability, around ecology, and so forth. It has a very good, broad, basic sort of handbook, which is then developed for each country. And I believe there's about 110 countries involved at the moment. In about 6 or 7 years ago, we were asked by the government of Kenya if we would create the first ever faith-based Education for Sustainable Development toolkit. And we did, and it's now part of the national curriculum in Kenya. It's being adopted in Tanzania, Uganda, other parts of the world, Bangladesh are looking at it, etc. And we did this in partnership with the various Christian groups, the various Muslim groups, and the various Hindu groups in Kenya. They all were participants, they were all partners in us in creating this program. And when my colleague Mary, who had pioneered this whole program, she was invited to the international conference on education for sustainable development, she gave a presentation and somebody stood up and said, well, come on, seriously, what's the difference between a faith-based toolkit for education for sustainable development and the ordinary one? And Mary gave, I think, a brilliant answer. She said, we start by saying thank you. You start by telling us how it's all going down the pan, to use a somewhat colloquial English phrase, if I may. And I think that's the difference, Miriam. The difference is that we come to finance as a gift. It is energy. That's all it is. It's energy. It's trapped energy. And this is why in Islam, you cannot have usury, you cannot have the charging of interest for money that just sits there. You can't do that because it's simply not allowed. It must be moving. And there's the story in the Bible of Jesus and the talents that he gives to or this the story of the man who gives talents to his servants, and he gives 1 10 and 1 5 and 1 and 1. And the one who's got 1 goes and buries it in the ground. So, you know, in case he might invest in something that goes wrong. So at the very least, he can give back after 10 years, he's won. And he gets absolutely, well, we use the phrase bollocked by the master, who says, what do you do that for? I gave you this to use, not to sit in the ground. And that vision that money is there to do good. It's not there to raise money so you can do good. It is there to do good. And this is central to FaithInvest. What we're basically saying to every faith group that joins us and with their investors has to draw up a theological statement. What are your core beliefs? Given your core beliefs, what are your core values? Given your core values, what is your disinvestment program or your negative screening program? What will you not touch? Given what you won't touch, what will you invest in? There is a kind of a logic, a journey. Now, many of the faiths have been very active. In fact, the faiths are the most active sector of the business world involved in the disinvestment movement from fossil fuels. Previously, it was disinvestment from companies engaged in South Africa during apartheid or the civil rights movement in the States. So there's an honorable tradition of the faiths withdrawing their finances in protest against the way that a government or a company is functioning. And that's great. There are many groups doing that. That's not what we do. What we do is we say, well, we know what you're against, and religions are terribly good at being against things. It's kind of a sort of hallmark, you know, thou shalt not. And if thou dost, thou ought to give us lots of money to make up for it. So we say, we know what you're against. What are you actually for? What do you want to do? So it's all very well talking about building a sustainable world and protesting when governments don't do it. But we, the faiths alone, could do that through our institutional faiths. Bear in mind that on top of that, research that we did many years ago, but has been updated recently, it tells us that about 30% of all investors are deeply involved in their own faith. Given that around about 15% of the world's investments are owned by the faiths, this gives us potentially almost half of the finances of the world could be influenced by faith. And we just haven't bothered. Well, now we're bothering.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think picking up on your theme of sort of approaching this with gratitude, and in our last panel, the theme of hope came up a lot. And I think that that's something that has sort of been surrounding the idea of ESG funds and this idea of divestment as, you know, a really kind of effective way of pressuring companies, organizations, governments into, you know, more environmentally friendly, zero carbon behaviors. But at the same time, ESG funds and other types of green investments are often criticized for maybe greenwashing or a lack of transparency. And so I'm wondering, given, you know, this complication, how do you approach that at FaithInvest, and what do you see as the role for FaithInvest or maybe religions in general in ensuring better accountability?
Well, you've hit on a crucial issue. As we've begun to engage with the faith investment groups, and they have begun to engage with their fund managers, because very few faiths actually run the faiths internally, they outhouse. The issue has come up. How do we do due diligence? How do we know that this wonderful sounding product, I mean, remember, in the 90s, the organization of business of choice as a green, as an ESG organization praised by everyone was Enron, which crashed and burned because of corruption. Not because it wasn't doing good things, but because of corruption. And so you've got the real issue of how on earth do you make sure that you're not going to put your money, you know, down the drain? And it's also, so there are three things really happening here that we're a part of. First of all, we're creating a gazetteer of fund managers who understand the religious values issue, the faith consistent investing dimension, and that's available for members on our members portal. And that gives you a chance, if you are thinking how, our old fund manager just used to say, well, look, you're going to get more money out of petrol than you are out of, bean sprouts. So we're going to keep you in petrol. How do you find someone who goes, of course, we would never think of putting it into petrol. These are the things that we're now in favor of. So you've got that. The second area is to actually produce the projects for investment ourselves. Not ourselves actually, but to go to the faith. So every major faith has a development fund, a development agency, whether it's Caritas for the Catholics, or things like Christian Aid or World Vision or Islamic Relief, or some of the Buddhist networks, the Taoist, everyone has their development agency. Now, those are all geared on giving grants. And in many cases, they're giving grants to projects that are fantastic, that are building up community wealth, they're building up community skills and abilities, but it's small scale. And it's grants, which means that you never actually help them get to a self-sufficient stage. They're always going to be coming back for money, and that money is shrinking. And the critique of grant is growing because it actually imprisons people in a situation of powerlessness. So what we're now looking at is we're saying to the major religious development agencies, why don't you put 15% of your grant money as what's called concessionary investment? That means you will put the money in to help a group develop a business plan, do the marketing, do the transport, do the environmental audit, do the scaling up potential, look at branding, all the things that could make them much more successful, create many more jobs within the framework of just transition, as well as ESG and SDGs. And so we're now beginning to see, we've been going for just over 3 years, and we're beginning to see pipelines of investable projects coming in via the faiths. So we have faith groups who can say, well, this group is great. And actually, we've been wondering whether they could get up to speed. And this, we're going to give them a grant to do that. We're going to invest in them to do that with no expectation we'll get a return. But when you give a grant, you don't get a return, except for these incredibly boring reports you have to write for grant givers. But this will shift the market. And the third area is possibly the most extraordinary at one level. We've been approached by the World Bank Climate Investment Fund, which is one of the most successful investment funds in the world and has helped to direct investment at a low return into building huge infrastructure projects that are sustainable, environmental, local. And with in partnership, but not under the World Bank, because we do have some problems with the World Bank, we are looking at creating a just transition fund, which will effectively be a religious development investment fund. We already have some, the Islamic Development Bank. We're now looking, and with the support of the Islamic Development Bank, and creating a multi-faith bank, because we have some faiths for whom investing $1 million in upscaling a organic cotton production site in somewhere like Bangladesh, or a hemp site, in order to create bags for the Hajj that are not plastic, are sustainable, and are actually wonderful to bring back home and hang on your wall. That's, there's a lot of our lot would be happy to put in $1 million as part of a package with others. We've got others who frankly are looking to put, I don't know, 5, 8, 10 billion into projects that they can feel that they're making their money work, making it do good. So that's how we're approaching it. And it's slow. Bring together religion and finance, and you've got two of the most conservative forces in the world. But you also have two of the most potentially dynamic forces in the world. And I love very much one of our Singaporean colleagues who says, I have faith, and I spell it R-I-S-K.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer. Those are really great.
Please call me Martin. Nobody, only my bank manager ever called me Mr. Palmer. That was usually when he was about to refuse me a loan. So I'm
there you
Martin,
go.
everybody.
Okay, Martin. Well, thank you so much for that kind of briefer on all things FaithInvest and DSGs and kind of how that shaped your work and approaches in this line of work. But also, we know a lot about ARC, the Alliance of Religions and Conservation, how much that was the big part of the last 20 years, 25 years. And you mentioned, I found this on the ARC website, that ARC closed after 23 years because, as you said, you did exactly what you set out to do, which a lot of people can't necessarily say when it comes to pursuing some of these big initiatives, that they actually were able to get where they wanted to be. So my first question is, what was your proudest achievement while at ARC? And then we'll shift over to a question regarding kind of looking at engaging with high-level leaders, as you did with ARC, and what that looks like, what that would look like now, or what are your impressions of working with high-level leaders in climate change and climate activism, in contrast to what we see now with the mass mobilization of young people in the streets focusing on climate activism, given the world's most pressing issues environmentally.
Hi, Ciara. That's a pile of questions in one go. My proudest moment, God. I suppose it happened every time we approached a new religious tradition and we said, we would like to invite you to come and meet us. And we'd like to invite you to distill, to write, no more than 2,000 words. What is it that your tradition actually believes we're here for? And what is our relationship to the rest of life on earth? And partly that was helped because what we could offer was any faith that did create such a statement, we could take them to Buckingham Palace and they would personally hand it over to Prince Philip. And that was always an attraction. I'll make no bones about that. He made it possible. He was the first secular leader to take the faith seriously as a social force, I would argue, since probably the French Revolution, and they took them seriously and then wiped them out. So, which is not quite what we were looking for. And he gave status to the role of the faith, the potential role of the faith at that time in environmental work. When we started in 1986, there were 3 religious environmental programs, 1 Buddhist, 1 Christian, 1 multi-faith. Now the UN reckons it's about 2.5 million religious projects. So we feel we've done some good. But every time we approached a faith tradition and said this, they did it. And in some cases, we actually managed to bring together traditions that had not spoken. The most extraordinary example of this was the Jains. The Jains of India, founded by Mahavira, around about 2,500 years ago, same time as the Buddha, they split into 3 different sects 1,800 years ago. Not particularly theological. One lot, the sky-clad Jains, refused to wear clothes and would run around with nothing on. And the other Jains were somewhat upset by this and so kind of disbanded them and sent them out. In order to prepare a statement on the Jain perspective on the environment, these 3 groups came together for the first time in 1,800 years because the issue of protecting Mother Earth was more important than their divisions. And another one would be when we helped develop the fatwas in Indonesia against the illegal wildlife trade and the illegal forestry trade. And the Pew Foundation, about 3 years later, did a survey to see what difference that make. And the Muslim leaders there were saying it has stopped our young people joining jihad. They are now doing a jihad to protect nature, not a jihad to kill the Christians or to kill the Hindus or kill other Muslims who don't agree with them. It had shifted the sense of something that young people could be deeply and passionately involved with as Muslims into something that was generous to the planet and to other people and not the other way, which was always a tiny, tiny minority, but unfortunately got the news. So I suppose my greatest surprise was just simply that asking that simple question, what do you actually believe? Why are we here? What is all this? Where did it come from? Where's it going? People going, oh my God, that's fascinating. You mean we could make a difference? Yes. And every time we asked, they stepped up to the mark. So that was the constant surprise. I suppose my biggest ever surprise, I think would have to be when, when Prince Philip said to me at one point, you know, I think I might actually make it into heaven as a result of what we're doing. I don't quite know where he thought he was going before that, but it was moderately reassuring. Now, what was the next question, Ciara, in your list of questions?
Yes, really interesting. Thank you for sharing. So basically, when it comes to what we see right now with a lot of mass mobilization of young leaders in terms of climate activism, that seems to be a shift. I don't know if that was always necessarily the case of what we see, and maybe that is due to the sense of urgency that we are all feeling now more than ever. But I'm just kind of curious, you worked with a lot of leaders that were very high up there in the UK and across the world at ARC, and kind of shifting what were maybe the pros and cons of working at that level, or how effective it was there versus what we see on the ground through grassroots efforts.
Very, very good question indeed. I mean, we did work with the key religious leaders because you need to get buy-in. But we always also, as is not quite answering your question initially, but we also always used to ask, well, who manages the money? Who manages the land? Who manages the properties? Who manages the education program? Who manages the health program? Who manages the pastoral care dimension? Because we didn't just want the religious leaders. I mean, if you bring, you know, God bless him, if you bring my Archbishop of Canterbury and ask him about, you know, educational policy in multi-faith schools in inner city Manchester, he wouldn't have a clue. Because that's not why he's there. What you need is the person who is actually directing and creating the curriculum for the multi-faith in inner city schools of Manchester, who does know what's going on and knows the problem. So we always brought, so for example, when we developed a whole program on green pilgrimage, we brought the people who ran the great sacred sites. We brought in the pilgrim tour group managers. Or when we were developing programs on, well, education, we would bring in the education people. So we always worked top, giving permission, people who had the real power to make a decision. And then you're right. I mean, we've watched with astonishment the rise of the youth movement, and we work with many of them. So for example, in fact, one of my key colleagues who heads our movement program is also the chair of the Laudato Si movement, which is the largest Catholic youth movement in the world, deeply involved. They're the ones who've been on protests and, you know, outside schools and all the rest of it. So we do work with them. I think, and this may not be very popular at one level, I've seen a lot of youth movements come and go. I've seen Occupy come and go. Here, Extinction Rebellion's come and gone. The danger with many of these movements, and Jesus has this wonderful parable of the sower who sows seeds, and some of the seeds whiz up. They've got no roots and they wither. Now, I think one of the roles of a place like the Fletcher School, which I know you're doing, is leadership training. Leadership training of faith leaders, leadership training of secular leaders to understand that faith can make a difference. And what I see coming out of the youth movement is that a small proportion, but a very, very thoughtful proportion, who have been through the heat, the fire, the excitement of protesting, are beginning to move into their professional life and saying, well, it's all very well shouting at people, but what if we actually knew enough to take over? What if we knew enough to be the people who make the decisions? But they need the training. And, you know, religion, science, and diplomacy, my God, you're halfway there, aren't you, already? But this need to actually take people a level beyond self-righteousness, anger, frustration, fear, eco-anxiety. Because one of the problems is, and I've watched this with great sadness, is that the way the environmental movement has essentially stolen religious garb. So they basically tell us we're guilty, we're sinful, we're wicked, and the apocalypse is about to come. And then they sell us indulgences, either through carbon trading, or you join Greenpeace, or you join WWF or the Nature Conservancy, give us your money, and we'll kind of make your sin go away. But it's a bad, bad model. It's a bad religious model. So we've seen the environmental movement create an atmosphere of engendered fear in order to milk you. And that's very bad. It does not, people are largely not energized by fear or anxiety. Their creativity is crushed. They don't feel they can contribute anything. So I think, yes, there's a tremendous youth movement. It desperately needs elements of being able to go the next level on the journey, which is not just to say, shout help, but to shout, what can we do to help? And that does mean that we have to make lifestyle choices, we have to make professional choices, where are we going to go into? And we need to have leadership opportunities for doing it. We're developing a program for young leaders emerging within the faith worlds and within the investment worlds. And I'd love to talk at some point at some sort of link with your leadership training here, because I think there's a lot we can do together. And we have to build the next level of those in charge or those making policy. We can't just say, oh, well, we protested and they didn't pay any attention. We are, the young people are the future. And I think also the one thing that does sadden me is I do feel that older generations are being treated as though they were disposable. And you know, you're not throwing away anything else, you're recycling it. Well, please recycle the older generation. We have learned a few things en route.
That's absolutely true. And I think that's one of the reasons we're so glad to have you with us today. I wish we had, you know, a whole day just to hear all the stories you have from your experiences doing this work. And I think I wanted to pick up on what you just said about environmental institutions and maybe this feeling of sort of being co-opted or some sense of futility. Because I think that feeling of maybe frustration is present amongst a lot of people, especially young people, and at the international level with gatherings like the UN Conference of Parties every year, which obviously makes, you know, tremendous gains, but at the same time is criticized for maybe being overly exclusive or lacking firm commitments or follow through from states who, you know, make all these claims and then the results are sometimes missing. So I'm wondering, sort of building on what you just said, what do you think the role of religious institutions, of organizations like FaithInvest could be in sort of addressing that disconnect?
Well, I've been at many COPs, not all by any stretch, because, you know, I quite prize my sanity. But I was at Kyoto and I saw the United States government betray the entire movement in one night. We knew exactly what had to be done. And the US government introduced the notion of carbon trading. And with that, the moral imperative to act was taken away. It was the sale of indulgences. And we had a reformation in the 16th century because of the sale of indulgences by the Catholic Church meant that individuals took no moral responsibility for their actions. And I've been at various other ones at various times, and they are appalling. As a structure, they do not work for the very simple reason that nation states are a relatively recent invention, and they are designed to protect the specific interests of a specific group, and of a specific group within that specific group, the powerful ones. The role of the faiths is that we are all international. We're all multinationals. We you know, even my church, Church of England, there are 70 million Anglicans around the world, and most of those live in sub-Saharan Africa on less than $1 a day. I don't think they all think they're English, but they do identify with this Anglican tradition. So we are international. We've always been international. And that's why we've been persecuted so much in the last 200 years, because as nation states came into being, a loyalty outside of the nation to the Pope or a Swami or to an imam or to a guru was considered betrayal of the national identity. So we've narrowed our sense of who we are by nationalism, and then we build an entire structure called the UN that is built on trying to get these narrow-minded blocs to collaborate together. Well, it's a flawed model. And what happened at Glasgow, and we were there in considerable numbers, was that basically that was pretty much largely irrelevant. What happened was the civil society movement, and I take my hat off here to the New York Times, who opened a hub. It was not part of the unofficial bit of it wasn't part of the NGO world, which is there because they're just clones. They just try to mirror the UN and its structures, and on the whole, they're far less efficient than the UN, and that's saying something. But what this was a collecting place. There were collecting places all across Glasgow. We were striking bargains with hundreds of different organizations on finance, on investment, on use of buildings, on land, on forestry, on food, on sustainable agriculture. We were making deals. Really, this is the first COP where there was a tale of two COPs. And the second COP was nothing to do with the official COP. That just, we knew it was not going to deliver, and Egypt won't deliver. So we have to create an alternative movement, not just by telling them what they should do. So for example, for the first time ever, and religious leaders, God bless them, they do love producing statements that are so blandingly statements of the dumbly obvious. You know, we think there is a problem, you should be sorting it out. Well, goodness gracious me, thank you for pointing that out to us. We hadn't noticed that the planet was going up in bloody smoke. This time, when the Pope brought together religious leaders from all the major faiths, we helped design that statement and put a contribution in. And it started with the usual stuff of telling everybody else what to do. But then the second half was unique because it said, we will commit to making big plans. And this is the Faith Plans program, which we at FaithInvest are overseeing, which is that every major faith tradition is doing an audit of what it owns and how it influences and so forth. But the second thing they said was, and we commit to move our investments into creating the world we want to see. So with that statement, in theory, the fourth largest investing group in the world has decided it will shift. That wasn't negotiated by the UN at COP. That wasn't negotiated by Boris Johnson. Now there's a surprise, but never mind, we won't go down that path. And it was negotiated by people on the ground who just got on with it. And my guess is that that is where the strength lies. I'm not sure we will go to Egypt because frankly, the power has moved from that structure. And it's time for us as civil society to take up our stakeholder role and to then vote in line with that, where you can vote, but also to work locally. I mean, we've done a lot of work with Arnold Schwarzenegger's R20, this notion of working with subnational groups, where you've got a city like San Francisco that just basically says, no, we're gonna bring in an environmental policy, and it's, you know, we're gonna bring in bans on cars. We can take action. We do not have to wait for governments. We do wait for governments. We may discover that that was not the way into the future. And the good book says in the Hebrew Bible, put not your trust in princes. Well, I quite liked my prince, but using the phrase prince as a political leader, I think it's a very good piece of wisdom. It also says, without vision, the people perish. We are not going to get a vision from COP.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would agree with you potentially on this call as well. And I think that's an important comment just about not relying on any one strategy and really needing to diversify sort of who we put our faith in to sort of really bring about change. And Ciara, I think, has the next question.
Yeah, Martin, I really appreciate you telling it how it is. We need more of that, especially when it comes to this topic. And I want to pass it off to Dr. Prodromou, who actually has a question, and then we'll move on to a brief Q&A. So, Dr. Prodromou.
Elizabeth.
Great, thank you. One last question, and I echo Ciara and Miriam. Thank you for your candor and for personality as part of a conversation about religion, science, and diplomacy. One of the things that we've seen today in our previous panels, and I think is front and center in your comments, is the demystification of religion. And you've helped us to understand how religions, plural, function internally when it comes to the ways in which they think about their responsibilities, whether it's on climate change or public health, and soon we'll talk about non-proliferation. And when it comes to the very uncomfortable issue of money. So I'll put it in the vernacular. Most faith traditions and faith leaders are ambivalent when it comes to talking about money. And I think they also suffer from a trust deficit when it comes to non-faith communities and the brand that faith communities have when it comes to money. I wondered, and I realize when we're talking about investment, we're talking at a far broader level than that, but ultimately we're talking about generating income streams and the investment of income and assets that can help do all the good things that you do. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how you've built the kind of trust that you clearly have with faith-based communities and leaders. Who are those within those communities? Is it generational? Is it gender? Is it profession specific that are most comfortable with the kinds of concepts that you're discussing? And then finally, just as a footnote to that, I wondered if you could say a little bit about the role of the media as either a help or a hindrance to the kind of work that you're doing with, first with ARC and now with FaithInvest.
Wow. Okay, I mean, you're absolutely right. Most faiths would love you to believe that they float on a kind of spiritual wealth that is given by the faithful who are so grateful for their services that they open their purses and they float the faith. That's simply not true. Every major faith has had to rely on its investments. In earlier days, that was very much to do with land, and the produce you have from that, the tithe system, taking a tithe of the land. And there was a very famous statement in the Middle Ages here in the UK or in England that if the Abbot of Glastonbury married the Abbess of Shaftesbury, they would own half of England. So there has always been, but we've been ambiguous about it, because every faith has had a teacher who has basically said, wealth, what is it? I mean, I love the story of Guru Nanak, the founder of the Sikhs, who is invited to this huge banquet by this incredibly wealthy merchant. And Guru Nanak is sat there and this man is, everything is over the top. And Guru Nanak says, takes a little pin out of his clothes and he gives it to the wealthy merchant. He says, excuse me, I wonder if you could look after this for me. And the merchant goes, yes, of course, Guru, of course. He said, well, could you give it back to me when I die? And we'll, and when we meet each other in the afterlife. And the merchant goes, how? I mean, I can't take anything into there. Oh, I thought the way you behaved with all this wealth, you thought it was forever. And that sort of puncturing of greed and of status through wealth is something that all faiths do, but they do have to rely on income being generated. And in Christianity in particular, you have that whole issue of God and mammon, and Christ's own phrase on this: you cannot serve both. You have to choose. You're going to serve God, you're going to serve mammon. There's a wonderful moment. We did a huge program. We've worked for many years with the Taoists in China, and the very sacred place where Lao Tzu wrote the Tao Te Ching, the great classic of Taoism, is a big pilgrimage center. And they joined our Green Pilgrimage program and have built the most ecological pilgrimage city in the world. And being China, they did it in 18 months. And when I was invited to go for the official opening, we were driving into town, and I read Chinese, classical Chinese. and we're heading down the main road, and there's a slip road off to the side. And in Chinese, it says the temple of the god of wealth, which is a very big figure in Chinese belief. But in English, it put the temple of God and Mammon. So that tension, which we feel is not always there in the Great Faith, but in most of them are very embarrassed about having money and about managing it, which is why they've kind of outhoused it. So that is a big problem and a big issue. The way that we've worked with this is to essentially create a club where religious fund managers can meet and talk and share, because really the faiths kind of treat them like troglodytes. You know, they kind of hide them in the basements and they let them out after dark when nobody can see them. There's a schizophrenic relationship to money, and partly that is because they have been stripped of it on numerous occasions, but also because really what consumerist capitalism has done has been to create a fake idol, a false god. And it's not popular to say that, but it does have to be said, because actually, if you look at the SDGs are really only a way of making consumerist capitalism a little more acceptable. We've got to be a hell of a lot more radical than that. So there's that. And I'm sorry, Elizabeth, I may have forgotten what the other question was.
Martin, actually, I think we'll move on to Q&A,
Sure.
given we have 10 minutes, and I just want to make sure that those
Okay.
get answered as
Sorry,
well.
Elizabeth, apologies.
No, it was about the media, but I'll catch up with you
Oh,
later.
yeah,
And also,
I've got a good
and
story for that.
also about our faith-based leadership program.
I'll finish with that if I remember. Okay, sorry, over to you, Ciara.
Yes. So one of our questions is actually, which is an important one to me, given I'm a Harvard Divinity student, but about your own faith and how that has informed your work in conservation and collaborating with other groups. I know when we talked last week, we also talked about the burnout experienced in this work of climate activism, seen by the film Don't Look Up, was something that all of us could relate to in one form or another. And so all that being said, one of the audience members wanted to know a little bit more about that.
Okay, well, my father was a vicar, an Anglican priest, and my mother was an atheist when she met him, because my grandfather was what we would now call a New Age con man. And he used to travel around the seaside resorts of England, reading people's fortunes based on their names on a system that he claimed had been revealed to him by an ancient Sumerian. I mean, absolute nonsense. And when he walked out on my mother and the family when she was 14, she basically said, right, a pox on all your religious stuff, all this crap. When she met my father, it took him 2 years to persuade her to go out with him. She was a psychotherapist and exceptionally bright, very funny, very clever. And if you grew up in a vicarage, and you have to go to church because that's dad's workplace, isn't it? I think you honestly have to become an atheist for a while just to get self-respect back. So I did, not helped by the fact that my mother would psychoanalyze hymns. And there was one dreadful moment where we were singing one of John Wesley's blood-drenched hymns, washed in the blood of the Lamb, the blood that flows from the, all this kind of stuff. And my mother I'm 15, my mother leans towards me and in a stage whisper, dear, this is all fear of menstruation. And as a 15-year-old, that's not really what you want to hear in church. But anyway, my mother kept me grounded in seeing that religion could be utterly ridiculous. But she also saw most of human behavior as ridiculous. My father just knew God was love, and he lived that and manifested it in every way in his life. And then I couldn't do geology at A level, which is our exam before you go into university, because nobody else wanted to do it. And I was rubbish at just about everything else apart from history and English. So I went to see my tutor, and she said, well, you could do theology. And I thought, well, that sounds similar to geology. So I went off and did theology as an atheist. And we did the Synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I thought, great, I'm going to prove that Jesus never existed. Didn't work. At the end of it, despite historical criticism, literary criticism, there was a voice there I couldn't refuse. Then I went, aged 18, to Hong Kong to work in a children's home for a year before going to university. And there I encountered other faiths. And I just realized, and in particular, I encountered Taoism. and its dynamic model of tension, which is yin and yang. Yin and yang is not a model of harmony. These two would destroy each other if they could do it. But they're neutral. There is nothing more moral about yin than there is about yang. They just are. And I found that helped me deal with the dualism that I found in Christianity of a good world and a bad world. And I've gone on from there to learn a great deal from every major faith. But for me, Christianity, this Christ story, still makes more sense of the good, the bad, the ugly, and the indifferent than any other story I've met, but it's not the only story. So I'm deeply shaped by a lot of what I've done, and that has fed me. And you talked about the issue of burnout. One of my dearest colleagues is Dakila Jungiompa, who was the head of WWF's FAITH program. And also she is environmental advisor to the Karmapa, one of the 4 spiritual leaders of Tibetan Buddhism. She grew up in the Himalayas, and she burnt out because of her work with WWF in the US. And if it had not been for her Buddhist spiritual traditions and the fact that the Karmapa said, Dakila, you know how to heal yourself. It's there in the scriptures. It's there in our meditation practices. She was able to rebuild herself. And she inspired me when I was getting really worn out to go back to my traditions, to the desert traditions, to the spirituality, to retreat. And yeah, you're right, Ciara, we have this problem that because we think we can save the world, Albert Schweitzer described Christ as having thrown himself against the wheel of history and having been broken by it. And I see people who believe that if they go and join X group and they work flat out every hour that God gave, quite a few that God doesn't know anything about, they will save the world. And then it doesn't work because it takes generations and they fall apart. And there's a whole group in the UK called recovering environmentalists, like alcoholics. It's bad. We talk about sustainability. We don't sustain our own people. And the route for sustaining our own people is spirituality. It has to be that you can go deep inside, find resources you did not know were there, relate them to other sources outside, be rebuilt, be honest about failures, recognize that's the style of narrative is up, down, and then back up again, get on your feet again, and go back perhaps a bit wiser than when you went in the last time. And I see that's not happening with a lot of people.
Thank you so much for that. I think this is really important with any activity in terms of social justice. A lot of the times we're not caring for ourselves because that cause is just like so big that we want to dedicate everything to it. And then we end up, what's the point if the fighters aren't able to take part in that fight in that sense? So
quite right.
Important. We have a few more minutes. Miriam, I don't know if there was another question you wanted to pose or if we ask about the media story.
Well, perhaps I'll come back to the media and finish with that one, because that's a very good question, Elizabeth. I've had the great fortune that for some reason, people, apart from my brother, like listening to me on the radio. My wife rang my brother recently, who is special needs, and said, oh, Nigel, you might like to listen to Martin. He's on the radio. On Radio 4 on the BBC, and my brother went, no, I only listen to Classic FM. And my wife went, but it's a really interesting thing. And he said, I know what he sounds like, and I know what he's going to say. So no, I'll just stick listening to the radio. But I'm very fortunate in that the BBC, for 30 years, I've done programs for the BBC, and basically we have a very good partnership. When we do outrageous things with bringing together different groups, and when we've got great stories, we go to them, and they're fantastic. But of course, that world has been radically disrupted. We also work with Al Jazeera, we work with PBS, but that world has been radically disrupted by the rise of social media. And I have to say, I am not on most social media. I've got enough time dealing with the letters and the emails, never mind anything else. But I think the enormous closing off of minds in so much of that is absolutely terrifying. We have now in our communications team at FaithInvest, we have someone specifically on social media, and you can do great things. When we launched our Faith Plans program on October the 4th, we got 8.5 million tweets. So that was great. We got it out there, but it's so thin. as a level of communication. However, I have to tell you one story. We have in the United Kingdom, as you do, tabloid newspapers, which their relationship with truth is somewhat thin. And Monday week ago, a story broke on the front page of the best-selling tabloid in Britain called The Sun. And this claimed that I had brought Chinese spies into Buckingham Palace to meet Prince Philip, disguised as Taoist monks, and that this was all part of a plot by the Chinese government to subvert the monarchy and therefore the British government. And there was a big picture of Prince Philip and myself and 3 Taoist monks whose faces had been blocked out. It was all very dramatic, front page, editorial, all the rest of it. Absolute bollocks. I mean, completely untrue. Has it damaged us? Very interestingly, and it then spread to about 100 other journals all around the world. Very interesting. No, it has created people going, really? You dress up as a Taoist monk to be a spy? And why would you want to spy on Martin anyway? Why would you want to spy on Prince Philip? So sometimes the ridiculousness of media can actually undershoot itself. And I think we sometimes give it a reverence and a respect that it honestly does not deserve. And I would come back to this thing of training leadership. When I was starting work on religious education, which in the UK is a compulsory subject in all schools, I used to run courses for schools on how to read newspapers, how to decode them. And I think we need to equip people with how to discern when you're being lied to. It's relatively easy. But I think in the end, it is this real struggle of how do you actually communicate to people. And I'll give you a story of the difficulties of communication, which has got nothing to do with the media, nothing to do with the social media. When I first got into the environmental movement back in the late 70s, I used to be asked to give talks at churches. I'm a lay preacher in the Church of England. And very often I would go in and I would say, do you realize that an area the size of Belgium has been destroyed in the Amazon in the last 12 months? Thinking, God, this is going to really get them energized. Every single time, and you have to remember that the British relationship with the European Union is somewhat problematic, and we were still in it at that point. Every single time, someone would come up to me after the talk, shake me firmly by the hand and say, I couldn't agree more about destroying Belgium. Congratulations.
Well, on that note, I think on that note, we are unfortunately at time, although I would be interested to hear your responses to those comments, maybe some other time. Martin, thank you so much for joining us. This was certainly really informative, really entertaining, and yeah, we just really appreciate you being here, especially with the time difference. So thank you so much. I think we're going to close out the keynote for now and take a short break, and then our next panel at 3:30 will be about the ethics of nuclear nonproliferation. So we invite you to stay on or come back for that. And again, Martin, thank you so much.
A pleasure. It's been a great privilege. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Martin.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.